Hey team, so we are actually moving on from the post-classical era, which we've been studying since the beginning of the school year. That's 1200 till 1450. You can see those empires in this image. We studied the Aztec Empire in green to the left, the Inca Empire in red underneath. We studied Song Dynasty to the right. We studied in Africa, Mali, and Great Zimbabwe, and then we studied the Mongols as well. Now we're moving into what is called the early modern era. As you can see in this map, the early modern era is 1450 until 1750. This will be broken up into two segments, land-based empires and maritime empires, so empires that stretch across oceans. We're going to start with land-based empires today. Now, three of these land-based empires that we are going to study are considered Islamic caliphates. A caliphate is the political religious state compromising the Muslim community and the lands and peoples under its dominion in the centuries following the death of their prophet Muhammad. The ruler of this caliphate is called the caliph, and that is the ruler of the Muslim community who held worldly as well as spiritual authority across the land. However, picking the next caliph was a really complicated task, and there was a lot of tension in the Muslim community over how the next caliph would be chosen. This led to a split in the Muslim community, Sunni versus Shia. Shia people believed that the next caliph should be someone directly related to Muhammad, a descendant of his. Whereas the Sunni people believed that the caliph should be the holiest Muslim, not necessarily having to be someone related to Muhammad. There are three post-classical era Islamic caliphates that precede the three that we will study in the upcoming weeks. These three post-classical era caliphates were Rashidun, Umayyad, and Abbasid. Those, again, will come right before the three Islamic caliphates that we'll study in the upcoming weeks. The three early modern era Islamic caliphates that we'll study in the upcoming weeks are seen in this image. In green is the Ottoman Empire, it's in modern-day Turkey. In red is the Safavid Empire, it's in modern-day Iran. And in purple is the Mughal Empire in modern-day India. We'll start with the Ottoman Empire today. These three empires will be named the Gunpowder Empires because of their vast use of gunpowder in battle. Make sure to take notes in your Unit 1 Day 14 spice chart, then copy and paste this spice chart into your historian journal under the Lecture Notes tab.
Again, the Ottomans were an empire that lasted from around 1300 CE until 1919, making it one of the longest lasting and richest empires in world history. The Ottomans managed to blend their pastoral nomadic roots with some very unnomadic empire building and some really impressive architecture like this and this and this, making them very different from, wait for it, the Mongols. The empire, or at least the dynasty, was founded by Osman Bey, and Ottoman is a Latinization of Osmanli, which basically means like the House of Osmond. No, Stan, the house, yes, oh my gosh. The Ottomans were greatest in the 15th and 16th centuries under two famous sultans. First, Mehmet the Conqueror ruled from 1451 to 1481 and expanded Ottoman control to the Balkans, which is why there are Bosnian Muslims today.
Thankfully, although lots of the city was destroyed, the famous Byzantine church of Hagia Sophia survived, and the Sultan was so awestruck by it that he ordered its conversion to a mosque to preserve it. As a result, Hagia Sophia, as it's known in Turkish, is still standing today. The Ottomans may have been conquerors, but they were keenly aware of the historical legacies they were inheriting along with the city of Constantinople. And speaking of Istanbul, let's clear up those names. Constantinople before and after the conquest was known to the Ottomans as Constantiniye, which, like likewise means City of Constantine in Arabic, and its state is that for most of the empire. Unofficially, people called it the city, and Greek phrases about being in or going to the city, translated as Stinboli, turned into what we now know as Istanbul. For convenience, I'll be referring to it as Istanbul from here on out, even though that wasn't really its official name until the 1920s. With Istanbul incorporated, Mehmet the Conqueror lived up to his name by pushing out in all directions, even getting the Ottomans a foothold on Crimea in addition to their Aegean and Anatolian holdings. They quickly figured out that the Europeans weren't really as tied to their religious fervor as they claimed, and were much more interested in fighting each other. So the Ottomans played enemies against each other and conquered peacewise, unmet by any wall of pan-European defense. And they got themselves a really nice domain out of it. Between their natural resources and control over key trading routes, they had a doubly advantageous position for most of their history. At this point, their biggest rival was the Republic of Venice, who held strategic trading posts across the Mediterranean, like Cyprus and Crete, in part thanks to their massive navy. But at the same time, Venice was also the Ottomans' closest trading partners, so when they weren't squabbling over islands, they were making each other fabulously rich. It was a fruitful, if tense relationship, and it happened in large part because of the Ottoman geography and both parties' willingness to cooperate across religious lines. It's largely due to this partnership that we ever got the Renaissance, as trade brought back classical Greek and Roman works preserved by Muslim scholars, in addition to the piles of cash that funded new artworks in Italy. Mehmet II loved his classics and thought of himself as a New Age Alexander, but truth be told, he wasn't all that far off in terms of lasting historical significance. And I'm talking a lot about the sultans here because the Ottoman government was pretty dependent on their head honcho being, you know, an empire. Aside from local governments, most administration relied solidly on the Sultan and his small army of viziers and bureaucrats.
But Ottoman expansion reached its greatest extent under Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. He took valuable territory in Mesopotamia and Egypt, thus securing control over the western parts of the Asian trade both over land and over sea. He also defeated the King of Hungary and laid siege to Vienna in 1526, and he turned the Ottomans into a huge naval power. Also, judging from his hat, he had the largest brain in human history. The Ottomans basically controlled about half of what the Romans controlled, but it was much more valuable because of all that Indian Ocean trade you remember from last week. So all this land brought a lot of wealth, but it needed to be ruled. The Ottomans could have followed the Roman model, where you send out generals and nobles to rule over conquered territories, or they could have demanded the allegiance of client kings like the Persians, or developed a civil service system like the Chinese, but instead they created an entirely new ruling class, a system that some historians call the slave aristocracy. So if you're a king, one of your main problems is hereditary nobles, because they always want to replace you, and they don't want to give you your money, and they want their ugly sons to marry your gorgeous daughters, etc. One way to deal with this problem is to make them part of the government so they feel included and shut up. Another way is to kill them. That's what they usually do in Russia. I'm whispering so Putin doesn't hear me. Ah! Putin! The Ottomans just bypassed the problem of hereditary nobles altogether by creating both an army and a bureaucracy from scratch so they would be loyal only to the Sultan. How? The Devshirme, a program in which they kidnapped Christian boys, converted them to Islam, and raised them either to be part of an elite military fighting force called the Janissaries, or to be government bureaucrats. Incidentally, which of those gigs would you prefer? Because I think that says a lot about you as a person. Either way, you weren't allowed to have kids, which prevented the whole hereditary nobles problem, and also ensured that the Ottoman government would contain quite a lot of eunuchs. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to Ottoman eunuchs. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's a blow-up globe. See what quitting smoking will get you, me from the past? Hey there, Ottoman eunuchs, how's it hanging? I'm just kidding, that was mean. Listen, there have been eunuchs all around this great planet of ours. But you're special. I'm not going to get into the details of why, because they're horrifying. I'm just going to link to an article in the video info. You started out just being harem guards, Ottoman eunuchs, which is kind of an obvious gig for you. But then you expanded. As had happened in China, you made yourselves indispensable, and you were often the center of palace intrigue. In fact, few people in the Ottoman Empire were as wealthy and important as many of you were. Way to turn lemons into lemonade. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought up lemons. Best wishes, John Green. This system eventually broke down as the Janissaries, who had guns, lobbied to be allowed to have families. But until that happened, the Ottoman system of using a mix of slave administrators and eunuchs to run everything worked incredibly well. But to return to the relationship between the Ottomans and the Venetians, after the Ottomans captured Egypt, they pretty much controlled the flow of trade through the Mediterranean. But the Venetians had centuries of experience as mariners and also lots of boats. Speaking of ships, I ship these guys. So the Ottomans were content to let the Venetians do all the actual trading and carrying of goods, and they just made their money from taxes. And that worked because both Venice and the Ottomans added value to each other. Healthy relationships, listen up, me from the past, aren't about extracting value. They have to be mutually beneficial to work. And boy, was that a mutually beneficial relationship. For instance, Venice became super rich. And being super rich was a prerequisite for the European Renaissance because all that art and learning required money, which is why Venice was a leading city at the beginning of the European Renaissance before being eclipsed by Florence, Rome, and, I don't know, say Rotterdam. Also, this relationship established firm connections between Europe and the Islamic world, which allowed ideas to flow again, especially old Greek ideas that had been preserved and built upon by Muslims. I mean, I guess those connections had existed for a long time, but crusades aren't a great way to exchange ideas. But perhaps the most crucial result of the Venetian and Ottoman control of trade is that it forced other European powers to look for different paths to the riches of the East. And that fueled huge investments in exploration. The Portuguese sailed south and east around the southern tip of Africa, and the Spanish went west, believing that the Indies and China were much closer than they turned out to be.
Hey team, bet you didn't expect to hear from Mr. Doyle at the end of your context video or your notes video. But I couldn't find a video that did this in an as concise way, so I made one myself. So this last section is focused on the jizya tax. You might be asking yourself, what is the jizya tax? Well, the tax paid on top of other taxes within the Ottoman Empire. But here's the key kicker. What makes it special is that it's only paid by non-Muslims. Why, you might be asking? This is in order to pay for the right to live under the Ottomans' protection and be allowed to continue your own faith that you practice, no matter what it may be, without being forced to convert to Islam. So, the jizya tax is an extra tax paid only by non-Muslims in order to continue practicing their own faith. That's all. Peace out.